Hello and welcome to Shaka Extra Time, a show that comes to you every Tuesday live on Facebook. And today I'm joined by Shaka Sali, aka the Kabale Kid. Hello, Shaka.
Hello, Paul.
How are you?
I definitely could be hugely terrific, except what is happening or not happening in the country where you and I call home.
Well, we'll have more of that in a minute, but let's first welcome all our Facebook followers watching us all over the world. Shaka Extra Time is a place where you get to talk to Shaka himself and ask some pertinent questions. Today we'll be talking about a wide range of issues, but mainly focus on the death of the former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan and what's going on in Uganda. So if you're watching, please send those comments. So Shaka, let's start maybe by talking a little bit about the death of the former UN chief, Kofi Annan. Some people call him the African statesman. Your reaction?
Well, I don't know about being a statesman, but I think he really deserves a very huge credit, especially for being the political fire brigade back in 2007, 2008, when Kenya was about actually to pretty much ban, really.
Well, yeah, he also has critics who say that, yes, you played a significant role in the Kenyan context, but when it came to Rwanda, he just stood by and just watched.
I think some of those people who talk about Kofi Annan and Rwanda, frankly, don't know their facts well, nor do they probably even have their history really well, because let's face it, the last time I checked, Kofi Annan was not Secretary General of the United Nations when the Rwandan genocide occurred. That credit goes to the late Dr. Boutros Boutros-Ghali, the Egyptian and arguably the first African Secretary General of the United Nations.
How about those who argue that he stood by and watched all these other conflicts take shape in Africa, or promoted and dined and with these some of these dictators on the continent?
You know, first of all, you really have to understand the role of the United Nations to be able to put it in the global political context. The highest position before Kofi Annan really was associated with in the UN system before he became the boss. He was the Under-Secretary General for essentially what you would call peacekeeping operations, and therefore was obviously at the Secretariat. And in fact, people have criticized him for probably having not done much when Somalia probably occurred, because they say it was on his watch. People have criticized him for Bosnia-Herzegovina. They have criticized him for Rwanda. Yeah. But let's face it, first of all, who actually controls the United Nations system?
It's the UN Security Council.
The UN Security Council, and it is obviously composed of 5 permanent members in that particular place. I don't see the name of Kofi Annan among the permanent members of the UN Security Council.
But he was
You're talking
in a
about
position...
the United States. You're talking about Russia. You're talking about China. You're talking about France. You're talking about Britain. And to be honest with you, when those allegations which are talked about occurred, to be honest with you, it looks like it probably could have been, in fact, the Clinton administration that was, in fact, in the front lines. It was really not so much about Kofi Annan. Kofi Annan was a top bureaucrat, a person that would be receiving orders. In the African context, they say, orders from above.
How about those people who are eulogizing him and saying very good things about him? In particular, what are some of those things that he stood for, the positive side of Kofi Annan?
Very good question, Paul. First of all, let's face it, Ali, like you and me, like any other human being, was simply a human being, and therefore can really be put on balance. In the sense that, yes, he had some very strong, sides on his side in terms of strength, and he also had some weaknesses. But let's face it, when you think about strength, he turned what other people would consider to be weakness into strength. This is a man who was largely defined by the key word, humility. Humility. A man that was defined by what you would consider to be soft power. He was not the kind of general the kind of president that would be considered to be commander-in-chief of his armed forces, including tanks, jet fighters, and helicopter gunships to boot. No. But he was a man that was very intellectually astute. He was, in fact, some people have considered him or regarded him as, he was a diplomat. By the way, Annan was also a man who came from the Ghanaian royalty. He came from the Ashanti Kingdom, the ancient Ashanti Great Kingdom. That is where he traces basically his upbringing. He was born in Kumasi. I've been lucky to be there, to be around and breathe the same air. But of course, unlike Kofi Annan, I am not royalty. At least I do not claim that.
Until his death, he had sort of shifted his focus to paying attention to human rights and as an advocate for social justice. Even recently, he was in Zimbabwe during the elections.
Yeah, in fact, while we were there.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So can you maybe speak to that a little bit?
He didn't really pretty much shift. He was always, I think, to be very honest with you, someone was very supportive of those values. Except that when you come to the situation where he happened to be a top bureaucrat in the United Nations, you have to understand that being a Secretary General involves really figuring out a way how to democratically dance around a lot of issues, especially when you have to satisfy especially the egos of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, which of course is in charge of global peace and stability. And look, he was at some point expected to serve as a secretary. And in other cases, he saw that he should probably serve as a general. And he himself has actually been on record that to be a very good Secretary General of the United Nations, there are situations that may require you to actually, in a sense, serve in a manner that reflects these 2 aspects of being a secretary sometimes and being a general at other times, and at some other times, perhaps, being a combination of the Secretary General.
Interesting. Let's maybe switch our conversation to what's happening in Uganda. Interesting developments as of yesterday. Soldiers and police, what has come to define the Ugandan government or the Uganda People's Army is the images that we see on the street, them beating up people. Your reaction?
It is obviously most unfortunate, especially given that you and I have direct ties to the subject that we are talking about. You and I have made a couple of telephone calls, I know, and we've talked to some different loved ones and other people that we care for, we care about, and we've talked to some government officials, at least find their, side of the story and all that kind of stuff. And of course, to tell you the truth, it doesn't look good. Why are we where we are? We're simply talking really about what you would call, a by-election. That is not really very, very important, with the exception of the fact that it used to be, that particular constituency used to be represented by a man who was arguably very popular across the political aisle. I mean, this man used to be known as Mr. National Resistance Movement. Abiriga, I'm talking about Abiriga, who used to essentially don almost every aspect of fabric and what have you on his body reflected the ruling party colors, which were probably somewhere between yellow and mustard. Others might, of course, say gold or a combination of all the 3 elements. But frankly, did it really have to take, for example, the driver of Baby Wine, a legitimate member of parliament, and a great Ugandan, African, and indeed the global artist? Did it really have to take that man's life? Did it have to take, for example, the imprisonment of Bobby Wine, the imprisonment of one of the youngest members of parliament from Mityana, Chaze, that kind of stuff? Did it really to be all this? This was really to be some kind of very ordinary type of by-election where somebody, if you obviously have an environment that you could at least referred to as an enabling environment where people live their normal lives, people would simply have gone and voted either for or against one particular party or the other. Yeah. But at the end of the day, what do we have really? Yeah. It doesn't look like it was a celebration of sorts. Instead, it looks like it is a mourning, sort of political mourning situation. And let's face it, from everything I have seen, it would seem to me that at least the chairman of the National Resistance Movement, who also happens to be the president of the Republic, Yoweri Museveni, in terms of politics, really, he kind of like scored an own goal, scored a goal against himself. Because let's face it, Yoweri Museveni is in his early or mid-70s. He has been in power since 1986. He's not growing any younger. His future is not really ahead of him, even though he claims to be the only visionary Ugandan alive. His vision is behind him. And yet, the vision of the young man, Bobi Wine, is ahead of him. You know why? Because that man was only 3 years when Yoweri Museveni seized the power back in Kampala in 1986. Yeah. And his father, apparently, was one of the supporters of Yoweri Museveni. He was a very rich guy who had a big farm somewhere in central Buganda. He had apparently, according to some of the sources I have heard from, more than 1,000 cows. And some of these cows actually went to become part of, you would say, the logistics, if you were, for the rebels of the NRM. So if in fact that is true, you could actually arguably say that you are looking now at a revolution that is actually busy eating its own children.
Interesting analysis on that, Shaka. You've had an opportunity to interact with Bobi Wine, both on your shows and socially. What makes Bobi Wine tick? Who is this young, remarkable guy?
Remarkably intelligent, very exposed, very confident. And of course, he also happens to have a gift, a very unique gift of being a remarkable artist. Others call it a musician. And when you listen to the lyrics of his music, his songs and stuff like that, I mean, this is a man that actually takes advantage of his art so that he can not only talk about being patriotic to his stomach, or the stomach of his family, and the stomach of his friends and relatives and stuff like that, but actually, this is a man who takes advantage and deploys his gift for the benefit of all of us, so that at the end of the day, we can at least smell some roses that reflect socio-economic justice for all of us. This is a man who basically turns his music into not a music of social control, but in fact, a music of social change. This is Bobi Wine. Very down to earth, laid back, very pleasant. You can't believe the kind of guy. That guy, he could very well be the future. Because let's face it, when we look at the technology that you guys have advantage of, especially when you compare and contrast our generation, for us, I have told you before that we are beneficiaries of the Gutenberg factor, the printing press. This thing is gone, man. Now it is the social media, the digital type of things. And this favors, guess who? Bobi Wine. All he has to do in terms of the basketball analogy, he basically has to do what they call just continue playing the ball so that he can simply
dribble.
Yeah, he just dribbles so that he can just wait for his time. Because, let's face it,
to score the three-pointer.
He just runs the clock. Because, let's face it, Yoweri Museveni, as I told you, his future, despite his claims to being visionary, is behind him.
Interesting. The hashtag Free Bobi Wine has gone global. It's the #1 thing on Google. It's the #1 thing on Twitter. Everybody is rallying. It appears that Bobi Wine's music does not only play in Uganda, but it's playing all over the world. His music transcends borders. And as a result, let's go to our Facebook comments. Let's start with Amanya Kevin, who said, one of Bobi Wine's song, Freedom, it talks about how misleaders, how leaders become misleaders and mentors become tormentors. opposition becomes opposition. What's your take, Shaka?
I couldn't agree with him more, really, because, in fact, when you think about it, people that have been in a position where they could really be like mentors to Bobi Wine and even to you, and perhaps even to a certain degree to me, basically what they have really accomplished is talking the talk. The question is, how come they have not been able to walk that very, talk that they talk about? They need to walk that talk so that Ugandans and Africans indeed, and humanity really, can begin to walk the walk.
When Bobi Wine was on your show, you asked him some very interesting questions that were intriguing. For example, you talked about, you asked him a question where, who is the primary stakeholder in Uganda? Is it the people or it's the current president? What was his answer?
Well, I'm sure that you had the answer yourself. I think you had the answer, basically, saying that let nobody deceive you. The primary stakeholder is the Ugandan people. The Ugandan people. But when it comes to the running of the affairs of Uganda, do Ugandan people really run those particular affairs? Because let's face it, you have a situation where you have had the Ugandan president saying, and this one, frankly, you can even play whatever sound bites that would reflect or claim to be a reflection of what he says. He says, my oil, my money, my army. Come on, man. I mean, all of us, the last time I checked, including Bobi Wine, have equal shares on this corporation called Uganda Republic. So it's up to Ugandans to assert their citizenship, to come up and say, wait a minute, we are not subjects of anybody here, because subjects do not have constitutional rights. If you don't have rights as a citizen, you don't have the power to hire or employ anybody. In fact, when you look at the Ugandan constitution, a man like Yoweri Museveni is supposed to be your employee, and my employee, and Bobby Wright's employee, and all the Ugandan taxpayers' employee, not the other way around.
For the record, he has said on record that he's not a servant of the people of Uganda.
But a servant of who?
Of himself.
No, but he has also, by the way, been quoted, and I hope correctly, that he is in this business to really work for his children and his grandchildren. But I think the last time I checked, he sort of danced around it and said he may in fact have been misquoted, or probably people may have put words in his mouth, but at least that's what I have seen in black and white. But when he went to Ruwero, when he came back and said, I have liberated you, who was he referring to? Was he referring to his children? Was he referring to his grandchildren? Of course not. He was referring to the people of Uganda. And the people of Uganda, frankly, have been very generous. They have been very kind enough. They have been very loving. They have laid back and given him the opportunity to be in control for the last 32 years. They just even opened, in fact, the political floodgates. They have removed even the age cap so that the man can actually become what some would characterize as a legitimate political monarch.
Or emperor. Shaka, you are watching Shaka Extra Time here on the Voice of America. And Shaka Extra Time is a show that comes to you every Tuesday. Every Tuesday. So today we are talking about Bobi Wine, a Ugandan artist and politician whose hashtag power, people power, is transcending across, is trending all over the world. And as we speak today, there are a lot of comments are coming in from Uganda. Let's go to another person called Balema. He says, Kabale Kid, thank you for being the voice of the voiceless. Please talk more about the current political situation in Uganda. Did it have to come to that point where we see soldiers beating up people on the streets?
Well, it obviously has been able to come to that point because Ugandans are not doing what they're expected to do. Ugandans are expected to be citizens who owe allegiance to the state, and therefore they are in control. They are the people who own Uganda. And whether you have a president, whether you have a chief justice, like Bat Katurebe, whether you have a speaker like Madame Kadaga, those are your employees. They are your employees. You're supposed to call shots. You're supposed to hire them and fire them whenever you want. But you can only do that if you work together. You can only do that if you are disciplined, if you know exactly what you are doing. And I think, to be honest with you, when you look at people like Bobby Wine, when you look at the changing demographics that he reflects, not only within Uganda, but within the region, the continent, and the world, really, to be honest with you, when you look at the power of changing demographics of the younger people who happen to form a majority of the people in Uganda as I talk, whether it is a question of going to elections, if in fact they are elections, not selections, because there are a lot of elections in Uganda, frankly, there is evidence, incontrovertible evidence, to suggest that they actually have been selections. These are situations where elections have been, the results have been predetermined before you actually even go to vote. You have had a situation where the government controls all the institutions, the government prints the ballot papers, the government gives to friendly people to tick some of those ballot papers before the event. In fact, there have been a lot of evidence for anybody who bothers to look for it. And when you look at the fact that the changing demographics, the young people are the majority in Uganda, in the region, on the continent, and when you look at those young people in tandem with social media, I think that is going to be the future. That is going to be the future. We are looking at the possibility, in fact, of these young people who are not invested in the status quo. They are not invested in what is there. They basically are invested in what would be characterized as change. Because you know what? All they have to lose really are the chains that are essentially tying them, so that they can also begin, if I may use the word that is not a particularly good one, but a lot of people use it, if they really want to eat. Okay. And they want to develop their society so that majority of people can benefit from the God-given resources.
Let's go to another Facebook comment here. Let's start with one. They say that what is President Yoweri Museveni scared about by him going after Bobby Wine? Bobby Wine is just an ordinary member of parliament. Why should the entire state unleash terror on just a member of parliament? And maybe another commenter from Sharon Bright Amanya. Please talk about the role of the international agencies in countries where the rule of law is not respected.
I think to answer your question, which has two parts, one, of course, is why should really Museveni act the way he's doing against Bobby Wine when Bobby is simply an ordinary member of parliament? You are right. When you look at the numbers, for example, in the Ugandan parliament, you have more than 400 members of parliament, by the way, who do not even have where to sit. They can't even fit in that building. That beautiful building was not.
Where are the Chinese when you need them?
I don't know. Well, they built the office of the president, the office of the vice president, the office of the foreign minister. And they have also built this beautiful highway from Entebbe airport, I think, to Kampala. But at least so far, unlike in Tanzania, unlike in Zimbabwe where we are, they have not built a parliament that can actually accommodate all the legislators that claim to be, claim to belong there. And so, in fact, if you looked at the numbers, if in fact you were to talk about democracy here, you looked at the mathematics. I was never, in fact, a mathematician. I happen to be, I would say, frankly, a very mediocre mathematician, and so probably my numbers wouldn't add up. But Museveni and his party have the numbers, and they are good at mathematics. They could actually push a bill into law anytime they want, even if they are sleeping. And you know, he has also said previously, I hope he doesn't think that I'm misquoting him. He was actually campaigning at one time, and he said he really doesn't care whether, in fact, you can make a contribution when you go into that very important house. The only thing that he wants from you is when it comes to voting for his bill, at least you get counted. Ugandans have to know better than that. Ugandans have to distinguish themselves from that type of rhetoric. That kind of arrogance, really, political arrogance, that does not belong to Uganda. It doesn't even belong in a democratic society on this planet Earth.
Shaka, tomorrow you're talking about the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. There are a lot of Facebook comments here coming in. I think maybe people have been looking up what you're doing, and they want you to liken what's going on in Uganda, the likes of Kizza Besigye and Bobi Wine. Could they become the next Martin Luther King Jr.?
They don't necessarily have to become the Martin or the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. of the world. They can only become Kizza Besigye of Nyakajeme. Is it Nyakajeme?
No. Rukunjiri.
Yeah, Rukunjiri is a very larger place, but I think he comes from somewhere there. And they can also become Bobi Wine from Jadondo. They can even do better than that. I think the aspect that they have in common is, for example, that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who actually happened also, by the way, not to be a physician, and therefore even if you are sick, you shouldn't expect him to treat you because he had no clinic, but he had the pulpit. And that pulpit, my brother, was great. That pulpit was great because he once said that injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere. So in this particular case, Uganda obviously is under the microscope as far as Martin Luther King Jr. is concerned. And when it comes to racism, he once said that he had a dream that one day his children would be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. So these are some of the things that are very, very important and very universal in terms of values. And so people like Besigye, people like Bobi Wine, and all these Ugandans and Africans who are on the side of democracy, on the side of freedom, on the side of socio-economic justice for all of us, are on the same page with the late Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
So, Shaka, our final question. What lessons do we learn from this whole fracas in Uganda?
I think what it is that Ugandans, as I said, they need to be disciplined, they need to be united, they need to be able to come together and speak with one voice. And in fact, among other things, they could say, you know what, President Yoweri Museveni, we have actually been lucky that you have been our president. You have served for the last 32 years. You have done some good work. You have done some other work that is not so good. I think it is time for you to step aside, pass on the baton to the younger generation like Bobi Wine, so that Uganda can shine more, it can develop, and it can do the things that is expected of by its daughters, its sons, its aunts, its uncles, and our grandparents.
Shaka, very briefly, how about those people who said that Bobi Wine supporters attacked the convoy of President Yoweri Museveni?
It's very unfortunate if, in fact, his supporters attacked the convoy of President Yoweri Museveni, because it is not only, in fact, a convoy of President Yoweri Museveni. Since they are the ones who hire President Yoweri Museveni, that convoy, in fact, belongs to them, as much as it belongs to the president.
Well, Shaka, on that note, unfortunately, we've run out of time, but this has been a very, very interesting conversation. And to you, all our fans out there watching us on Facebook Live, Shaka Extra Time is a place where you get to talk to Shaka and ask a lot of questions. Until then, so long from Washington. Thank you so much.
HIV and other